Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I guess first off, a big happy birthday to the 50th birthday of the Clean Water Act. This is a web series, the 50 years of the Clean Water Act, to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And today's webinar is on remaining challenges of the Clean Water Act in Michigan. My name is Ryan Blazik. I'm with Eagle's Environmental Support Division. Just going to be helping to moderate this webinar. This webinar is brought to you by Eagle. You can also see the other Clean Water Act 50th anniversary events going on by going to www.michigan.gov/CWA50. I have a poll up, so please take a minute to answer that if you haven't already. And we'll go ahead and go through a couple logistical things first. Just so you're aware, our lines are going to be muted during this webinar. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar, but we're going to save those questions for the end. We're going to have a Q&A session with our guests at the very end. And then also we're recording this webinar. It'll be on that CWA 50 page that I just mentioned and on our YouTube channel. And I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. And in case you're interested, I'll go ahead and share those results. All right, so you should be seeing those. It looks like 70% of us on the line are from a government agency, 5% from a nonprofit, 9% environmental consultant, 9% other job, and then 7% who just love Michigan's water resources. And again, the question was, do you have a job related to the Clean Water Act? So thank you all for answering that question. All right. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I would like to invite Phil Argeroff, who is Assistant Division Director for Water Resources Division with Eagle, to turn his camera on and get this webinar kicked off for us. Welcome, Phil.
Well, thanks a lot, Ryan. Welcome to our third webinar on the Clean Water Act. It's the 50th anniversary, of course. If you were able to join us for the first two webinars, we discussed the history and the structure of the significant environmental law in the first webinar. We then discussed success stories of the Clean Water Act in webinar 2. Success stories included dam removal benefits, benefits of our Michigan wetland protection law, important successes in the non-point source program, and progress in cleaning up what was at one time Michigan's most polluted waterway, the Rouge River. Today, our last webinar on the Clean Water Act, the focus is remaining challenges. We have 4 items to present. The first is about impaired water. Mike Alexander, our WRD Surface Water and Assessment Section Manager, will present on that one. Total maximum daily loads are established for point and non-point sources to correct these impaired issues. Correction of point sources have or are successfully meeting our TMDLs. Addressing non-point sources, especially outside of urban areas, is more of a challenge. Second presentation is about our National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, the NPDES permitting program. Technology treatment standards are an important part of this. They were established by EPA for categories of discharges, and we previously discussed an important goal of the Clean Water Act, which is elimination of pollution. It's driven by this requirement. Tarek Buckmaster, a supervisor in our permit section, will present on this topic and how these revisions to this process could help. The third presentation will be from Zach Richardson of Eagle's Office of Climate and Energy. He'll discuss Michigan's Healthy Climate Plan. I just want to also note that Water Resources Division will be publicly noticing our division climate plan towards the end of this year. It's built off this Michigan plan, and it's to directly address some of the critical issues moving forward. We're definitely seeing higher, more frequent and higher intensity rain events that we need to adjust for. So stay tuned and be involved with review of that document. And our last presentation is on emerging pollutants. Many of us know or read about PFAS. Brian Zuber from WRD's Emerging Pollution section will be presenting on what we will do retroactively under the Clean Water Act to address emerging pollutants. And we have a good process in place to do this. But can this be changed to a proactive process? I think that's an important discussion point and an important challenge. So thanks again for being here. Today, the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act signifies an important day for environmental protection. So thanks a lot, and we'll start with the first presentation from Mike.
Thanks, Phil. Sharing my screen, sorry. Here we go. As Phil said, we're going to talk about some of the challenges still facing Michigan surface waters. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we get to determining these, how we got to determining these challenges, and talk a little bit about our monitoring efforts. Here's a figure of effort that we completed in 2022, sampling around the state of Michigan. This includes a lot of work. We conducted a significant amount of biological community surveys, including fish and macroinvertebrates. We looked at fish tissue around the state, water chemistry, including bacteria, nutrients, and other chemicals of concern, as well as a lot of other things. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use this information. Well, quite simply, we use this information to answer questions, pretty significant questions to us. You know, are our fish safe to eat? Are our surface waters safe to swim and play in? Do our macroinvertebrate communities and our bugs and fish and other things, are they healthy? And then what do we do with this information? We use it to assess, these are called uses. Those things are referred to as our designated uses. And we want to determine, are our surface waters supporting these various uses? And what happens if they don't? Well, the Clean Water Act requires us to develop what's referred to as a total maximum daily load, which is a big phrase that basically we're required to identify pollutants of concern and their sources and current loadings for waters that aren't supporting those uses. We then determine the maximum amount of that particular pollutant, like an E. coli or a nutrient or a other chemical of concern, that can be allowed in that surface water and still support that use. It's made up of 3 components. There's a point source contribution. There's a non-point source contributions, which we're going to focus on today. And then we have to include some margin of safety in that load. And it helps us to account for the uncertainty associated with developing that nutrient load. So now let's talk about those ongoing challenges and what we're facing. Why are they ongoing challenges? Many of them are widespread impairments. The non-point source components can be challenging because they quite typically can be outside of our water resources programs. And when they might be in our programs, we lack explicit regulatory controls. The examples that I want to share with everyone today are some bioaccumulative chemicals of concern for mercury and PCBs. And then I want to talk about some diffuse land sources, including E. coli bacteria and nutrients. But let's start talking about our fish consumption issues at first. This map here, it's quite a daunting map. And what it shows is all of Michigan's surface waters, including Great Lakes, that have impairments due to the ongoing sources of mercury and PCB. Now, I want to point out first and foremost, this doesn't mean that you can't eat fish in Michigan. Absolutely, you can. What it means is that you need to be careful about what you eat, when you eat it. And so the way you determine what's safe to eat, next time you go fishing, get on Michigan Department of Health and Human Services webpage, do a search for those Eat Safe Fish guidelines, and enjoy Michigan's resource. But this does show we have some ongoing sources. This next map shows that one of the most significant sources we have for mercury and PCBs is through atmospheric deposition. This map shows all of Michigan's surface waters that are currently covered under a statewide statewide mercury and PCB TMDLs, with that significant source being identified as atmospheric deposition. Now, there has been success in reducing some of these nutrient sources, as this next figure shows. This is a figure showing PCB concentrations in carp in the Great Lakes. And you can see from the 1990s through 2014, we've made a lot of progress in reducing that source. And we'll continue to work with our Air Quality Division and EPA in reducing those ongoing atmospheric depositional sources for mercury and PCBs, but we still have some work to go. Next, I want to show some examples of these diffuse land sources. These are the ones that we're struggling with as well. One being our E. coli around Michigan. This map shows all of the watersheds in Michigan that are currently covered under our statewide TMDL for E. coli. Our next example is nutrients. This map shows all of our TMDLs, all of our water bodies that currently have a TMDL in place for nutrients, or water bodies that are currently listed as impaired with future TMDL development that could be required, that is or could be required. Two of those examples would be Western Lake Erie watershed, which I'm sure some folks are familiar with, and the Saginaw Bay watershed. So the big issue is non-point source controls. Well, and how do we get those non-point source controls implemented and those non-point source nutrients reduced? Section 319 of the Clean Water Act created what we refer to as a non-regulatory program to help us address these non-point source inputs to our Michigan surface waters. Well, how do we do that? How do we get those reductions that we need to get back to supporting our designated uses for these diffuse land sources? Well, it's basically we would partner with volunteers, and we hope that we can protect our existing high quality waters and restore those other designated uses such as fish community, bug community, and E. coli that are coming from those diffuse land sources. How do we go about doing that? Well, we provide them pass-through money through grants. We give them money through grants to local entities, conservation districts, watershed management group, or watershed councils, and we help them develop watershed management plans. What those plans do is they identify the ongoing sources, they identify the best places to implement practices to get reductions in those nutrients or E. coli or those other diffuse sources, those non-point source pollutants. The next thing we do is we give more grants to help implement those practices and try to get them in place. Now, as Phil said, the second presentation that we gave in this series, we talked about non-point source successes, and we've been very successful at a very local scale, at a stream scale, at reducing those non-point source contributions. But where we're struggling right now is to be getting reductions on a watershed-wide scale. We can't seem to get that significant reduction, for example, to Western Lake Erie yet. But we hope to. We'll talk about some ways that maybe we can continue to improve those reductions. As I said, I wanted to show these two examples because we're very proud of them. I think Alyssa presented these in our presentation last week. This is an example of a culvert replacement that showed some real success. You can see in the one picture the erosion around it. Now we've put in a nice road crossing. We have reduced restrictions in flow and a much better improved habitat. The second example is just some stream side restoration activities, and those have been successful. So we can be successful at a local scale. We just have to try and work on getting that success at a larger scale. So let's talk about some of the challenges. Well, some of the things we have some control over to start with is in the larger animal feeding operations. Those are currently covered under our NPDS program. And our larger urban settings, those are covered under our MS4 permits program. So we do have some controls, but all other agricultural and urban land use, all other non-point sources from those activities are covered under this voluntary programs. Some other issues that we still face for these types of diffuse sources are through septic systems. We lack a statewide septic code. We do have some current scattered local ordinances to address failing septic systems, but without a statewide control, that's going to be an ongoing source. We also show some local ordinances that have been adopted to protect floodplains, lakes, other things, and groundwater, to just name a few. But again, we don't have anything on a statewide level to help with these type of controls. So what are the challenges? Well, as we've said, we've seen some success at the local scale, but to increase that, we need to increase our capacity within these organizations, within our watershed councils, within our conservation districts. If we increase that capacity, we'll be able to increase that local connection with the landowners and hopefully be able to get more implementation as we go forward. Current funding levels, again, they've helped us reach this success at that local level, at that stream scale, stream reach level. But to be able to get it on a more watershed scale level, we're going to need more resources to be able to take advantage of the tools we have available to us right now. So those are the challenges that we're facing with our non-point source program. And I'll be around to help answer any questions as we go through this presentation. Right now, I want to turn it over to Tarek Buckmaster for the next part of our presentation.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, I'm Tarek Buckmaster, and I supervise the Industrial Permits Unit and Permits Section in the Water Resources Division. My unit's responsible for issuing National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDS permits, for all the industrial facilities with direct discharges to the surface waters of the state. This covers a wide range of facilities, which includes steam electric power generating plants, steel mills, paper plants, limestone, sand, and gravel mines, groundwater remediation treatment systems, and public swimming pools and splash pads. Today, I'm going to give a brief presentation on one of the remaining challenges of the Clean Water Act, the reevaluation and updates to the existing technology-based effluent limitations, along with the establishment of standards for new industries within the Effluent Limitation Guideline Program. As was covered previously, in 1972, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was amended to form what we know of today as the Clean Water Act. The act required that point source discharges of industrial and municipal wastewater have National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDS permits, which limit the amount of pollutants that can be discharged. One goal of the Clean Water Act was to eliminate the discharge of pollutants in navigable waters by 1985. While this ambitious goal is yet to be met, it emphasizes the Clean Water Act approach to setting national treatment technology standards and technology-based effluent limitations, or TBELs, and NPDS permits. In establishing these technology-based effluent limitations, EPA sought to balance the economics of pollution control with the goal of restoring water quality. EPA's goal in establishing ELGs is to ensure that industrial facilities with similar characteristics will be required to meet similar effluent limitations. In establishing the ELGs, EPA must consider the industry-wide economic achievability of implementing the best pollution control technologies available to the industry. These national requirements must be met regardless of which state the facility is located or the size of the receiving water for the discharge. However, once set, the ELGs do not require the use of the specific technology selected as the basis for the ELGs. The ELGs just set numeric effluent limitations or narrative effluent limitations such as best management practices, or BMPs, that are required to be included in NPDS permits. In some cases, NPDS permits will include more restrictive limits than those specified in the ELGs. So when setting permit limits, any water quality-based effluent limitation or state standard that is more restrictive for a particular parameter is included in the permit. To date, EPA has promulgated ELGs for about 60 industries. On this slide, I've listed a few examples of the different types of ELGs that have been established. As you can see, there are a wide range of common industries that have been evaluated, which are listed here, including battery manufacturing, dairy products, organic chemicals manufacturing, paper mills, steam electric plants, and sugar processing plants. With the start of the development of the Clean Water Act in 1972, many of the ELGs were established in the early 70s and have not been updated recently or even since they were first promulgated. However, as would be expected, there have been many advances in the treatment technologies used by these industries, along with changes in the characteristics of the wastewaters discharged or changes made in the products. So in order to make progress in meeting the goal of eliminating the discharge of pollutants, EPA needs to continue to review and update the ELGs to base them upon the current best available treatment technologies, covering current wastewater types and current products manufactured by each industry. And I just want to note that the asterisks indicate that some of these ELGs are currently being reviewed and evaluated by EPA specific to the discharge of PFAS pollutants for the manufacture, use, and/or discharge of these pollutants into the surface waters. Where EPA has not promulgated ELGs, or where the promulgated ELGs did not evaluate specific products or processes, the states are required to establish technology-based effluent limitations using best professional judgment, or BPJ. States are required to follow processes like those EPA uses for ELG development in establishing these BPJ standards. But as you'd expect, this process can be extensive and time-consuming. Therefore, it is much more efficient for EPA to review and update the ELGs on a regular basis to address changes in industry processes, wastewater characteristics, and treatment technologies. In Michigan, we used the BPJ process in the 80s to set industry-specific effluent limitations for total suspended solids for both state DNR and private aquaculture facilities. Once EPA promulgated ELGs for this industry in 2004 that only required the use of best management practices, our MPDS permits were required to include both the ELG BMP requirements along with the state's total suspended solids limitations. Michigan has also established treatment-specific BPJ-based effluent limitations for different types of wastewater remediation treatment technologies, such as granular activated carbon filtration and air stripping for volatile organics. Michigan has used these BPJ-based limitations specifically for the treatment of petroleum-related cleanups or PFAS contamination remediations to ensure that the treatment systems are being operated and maintained properly, and the discharge of pollutants has been minimized using cost-effective treatment methods. EPA is required to review and update the ELGs annually in accordance with the requirements set in the Clean Water Act. EPA publishes a plan every other year establishing a schedule for the annual reviews of the selected ELGs, with the ELGs being updated if deemed necessary. These plans may also identify industries for review that have yet to have ELGs promulgated. Once selected, EPA is required to complete the ELG reviews and updates within 3 years, which includes a publishing of the proposed revisions to the ELG before the promulgation of the revised ELG. For EPA's current biannual ELG review plan released last year, EPA selected a number of PFAS manufacturing and processing industries for review, including the organic chemical manufacturing industry, the metal finishing industry for chrome plating operations, along with the textile mill industry and the landfill category. EPA is also reviewing the meat and poultry products category and the steam electric power generating category, even though this category was last reviewed and revised in 2020. So while the Clean Water Act has resulted in EPA setting national effluent limitation guidelines for 60 industries, promulgating technology-based effluent limitations for inclusion in MPDS permits, there's still a need for ongoing reviews and revisions to the ELGs in order to continue to make progress towards meeting the goals of the Clean Water Act, eliminating the discharge of pollutants into surface waters. I can address any comments or questions you have at the end of these presentations. And next up is Zach Richardson from the Office of Climate and Energy.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and try to share my screen here. All right. Hopefully everyone's seeing what they expect to be seeing. But yeah, good to be here. I'm Zach Richardson. I'm a Climate Action Officer in the Office of Climate and Energy here in Eagle. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the My Healthy Climate Plan, which is Michigan's plan for reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. So we already know that the climate crisis here in Michigan is real and costly. We're already feeling the effects of climate change. Compared to averages in 1900, Michigan is almost 3 degrees warmer with hotter and drier summers and falls. And again, compared to 1900, we now get around 5 more inches of rain per year, with rainier winters and springs that feature more frequent and more intense storms. If we fail to act with urgency, the effects of climate change are on track to worsen, and those are going to disproportionately affect the state's most vulnerable residents and communities. We can avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis by acting right now to transition to carbon neutrality quickly and without leaving anyone behind. We know that every dollar that we invest right now in climate adaptation averts between $4 and $11 in future damages from natural disasters. So by undertaking this transition, this transition will reward Michiganders not only with reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but also better economic opportunities and jobs, affordable and reliable energy, improved public health, lower costs for families and businesses, and environmental justice, clean air, and clean water for everyone. So, what does transitioning quickly to carbon neutrality mean? So in 2019, Governor Whitmer created the Office of Climate and Energy here within Eagle to help guide the state's response to that question. At that time, Michigan also joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan coalition of governors that are committed to upholding the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in 2020, the governor commissioned the Office of Climate and Energy to create the My Healthy Climate Plan as the document that will help guide us on that path to meeting that commitment. Developing the plan was a long process, and the Council on Climate Solutions formed 6 expert work groups that delivered recommendations to the Office of Climate and Energy. And OCE released the draft version of the plan in January of 2022, and we engaged stakeholders through accepting public comments and listening sessions, and we revised the draft to publish the final version of the plan in April of this year. So at a very high level, the plan's goals are to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, which again is in line with that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And as interim targets, relative to a baseline year of 2005, we set targets of a 52% emission reductions by 2030 and a 28% reduction in emissions by 2025. And in addition to those greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we are also seeking to make right past environmental injustices and prevent new environmental injustices from cropping up as we transition away from fossil fuels. So at again, a high level, there are sort of 8 main objectives of the My Healthy Climate Plan. So to protect Michiganders from the worst impacts of climate change, to spur economic development and create good paying jobs, lower energy and transportation costs, protect and improve the health of Michiganders, position Michigan as a leader on climate action and become energy independent, and again, addressing environmental injustices, and perhaps most relevant for the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, protecting our natural resources and wildlife. So how do we actually go about achieving those objectives? The plan really focuses on sort of what are the short-term goals that we can take, short-term actions that we can take in the next 8 years, so between now and 2030, to set us on the right track for that 20-year period from 2030 to 2050. And the roadmap to 2030 is organized around 6 action areas. 5 of those correspond to the main emissions sectors, and we'll go through those one by one. But the 6th is environmental justice. Environmental justice has its own standalone section up front, but we also wove environmental justice considerations throughout every emission sector to ensure that it was addressed thoroughly and comprehensively. And each of these 6 action areas has a few top line items that will be fundamental to meeting our overall goals. So I'll step through now those 6 those items are. So like I said, addressing environmental justice is a key part of the My Healthy Climate Plan. And the top line item here is the Justice 40. So the federal government has Justice 40 requirements to ensure that at least 40% of climate and water infrastructure spending benefits disadvantaged communities. And the My Healthy Climate Plan commits to do the same for funding from the state of Michigan. And we'll be developing those guidelines of what constitutes climate spending, what constitutes a benefit, who are, or what constitutes a disadvantaged community. We'll be developing those guidelines in partnership with the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate, as well as leaders in disadvantaged communities. And we'll be expanding on the just transition work as well to ensure that workers receive engagement and training to make sure that no one is left behind in the clean energy transition. Now, on the subject of clean energy in Michigan, the sector with the highest proportion of emissions is energy production. And so our goals for 2030 are to generate 60% of the state's electricity from renewable resources, including 10% from distributed generation like rooftop solar, as well as phasing out the remaining coal-fired power plants in the state by 2030. And as we go about these changes, we want to also make sure that we are not increasing energy burden, particularly on low-income households. So we're seeking to limit energy burden for those households to no more than 6% of their annual income spent on heating and powering their homes. Now, obviously, this is a large transition, so we'll be working with clean energy developers and communities to identify best practices for siting renewable energy systems, as well as expanding the state's energy storage target to accommodate grid scale storage of energy produced from renewables. And the second largest emitting sector in Michigan is transportation. So we sort of see two main prongs here, which is one, we need to build the infrastructure necessary to support electric vehicles here in Michigan. And the target by 2030 is to have 2 million electric vehicles on the roads. And the recently released My Future Mobility Plan indicates that infrastructure consists of, at least in part, 100,000 EV chargers across the state to support those 2 million vehicles. But we also want to increase access to other clean transportation options, including public transit. So we do want to make sure that we're, in addition to supporting electric vehicles, investing in efficient, clean public transit, including bike paths, walking trails, to make sure that everyone has an access to a broad possible range of transportation options. Now, the third sector that we're going to talk about here is the built environment. So these are the homes and businesses. And for this sector, we are targeting an overall reduction of 17% by 2030 through both energy efficiency improvements and decarbonization. But you'll notice that 17% is lower than 52% that we need overall by 2030. So the built environment can be a little tricky. Building stock is slow to turn over, but what this means is that we need to go faster in other sectors, especially transportation and energy production, to meet that 52% reduction overall goal by 2030. And we want to make sure that we're investing in repairing and improving homes and businesses to reduce costs, especially for low-income households and small businesses. Now, for the industrial sector in particular, we really want to encourage clean innovation where it's possible. There are some industrial processes that are hard to decarbonize. We don't really know how yet. We need new innovation and technology. So we want to encourage private enterprise to develop those technologies. And we also want to see a reduction in the waste that we produce in the state. So by 2030, we're seeking to cut food waste in half and to triple Michigan's recycling rate from around 15% right now to 45% in 8 years. And last, but very certainly not least, the My Healthy Climate Plan seeks to protect Michigan's lands and water. So this is in line with the National America the Beautiful initiative. We seek to protect 30% of Michigan's land and water by 2030, and that will increase access to recreational opportunities and protect biodiversity while also naturally capturing greenhouse gas emissions. We would also seek to avoid land use conversion that adds greenhouse gas emissions, as well as protecting and restoring wetlands and waterways, where that's appropriate. And so those are a lot of really great, ambitious goals, but how will we actually implement the My Healthy Climate Plan? And I think that is a pretty exciting question to be able to answer, because we have the means to act, particularly with the influx of federal dollars from the IIJA and IRA bills. This is really a pivotal moment. But that said, the Office of Climate and Energy is fairly small relative to the size of the challenge at hand. But fortunately, there are a lot of great folks doing work on climate throughout Michigan in state and local governments, colleges and universities, private businesses and nonprofits. And the Office of Climate and Energy, we've already been working with and will continue to work with everyone that is ready to help us implement the plan and meet these goals. So thank you so much for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And next up, for your listening pleasure, Brian Zuber.
Thank you, Zach. Excellent. All right. All right, thank you. I'm Brian Zuber. I work at Eagle in the Emerging Pollutants section of the Water Resources Division. I'm going to talk a little bit about emerging pollutants in general and how they interact with the Clean Water Act. Emerging pollutants are chemicals or materials with a developing understanding of the potential or real threat to human health and or the environment. Historical examples include DDT and PCBs, and current emerging pollutants that we're facing are PFAS, microplastics, and pharmaceuticals. The time scale from the widespread acceptance and use of emerging pollutants and taking decisive action is often lengthy. For various reasons, it can take a long time between first noticing a problem, then understanding the scale of the impact, and finally discovering the cause. There's a lot of uncertainty with emerging pollutants. It takes a long time to get human health and environmental impact information. We use results from studies conducted all over the world to develop regulatory limits for new chemicals. Using the family of chemicals called PFAS as an example, there are currently over 9,000 different PFAS compounds. We currently have regulatory limits for 3 of those compounds in surface waters. Even after we discover a specific chemical or compound causing a problem, it is often not readily known what types of industry use it or how. Once we find the sources, knowing how to effectively clean up the contamination can be a difficult process of trial and error. Early treatments can be very expensive and sometimes ineffective on a large scale. Understanding how to collect samples and test them in laboratories also involves trial and error. As an example, it was first recommended to us that PFAS sampling teams couldn't wear deodorant or floss on the day we collect samples because PFAS are used in making some of them. It turns out the chances of contaminating your sample with PFAS because of your deodorant or floss is pretty much 0. Then comes the ultimate challenge. How do we regulate these emerging pollutants? First, you can see in this PFAS example, emerging pollutants can be found in unexpected places. It can take a long time to find where these chemicals end up. Keeping with the PFAS example, in 2011, a regulatory limit for Pfoa, one of the PFAS compounds, was developed. In 2012 and 2013, we conducted a limited initial statewide PFAS sampling survey. In 2014, a regulatory limit was developed for the second PFAS compound, PFOS. In 2016, we conducted an initial survey of PFAS in the Flint River watershed. Based on those results, in 2017, we collected samples at 3 wastewater treatment plants that discharged to the Flint River. Further effort in sampling led us to identifying an industrial facility that discharges to one of the wastewater treatment plants that we had sampled as a significant source of PFAS to the Flint River. Although this work involved many staff within Eagle's Water Resources Division, we wouldn't be this far without the significant effort from former and current staff in the surface water assessment section. Another significant challenge with emerging pollutants is communicating with industries and the public. Immediately available alternative ingredients or controls may be too expensive or not as effective, as is still the case with firefighting foam at airports. New regulations appear to come too quickly to industry, but too slowly for the public. As I mentioned before, in most cases, early treatment methods may be prohibitively expensive or not very effective. Additionally, some of these methods have their own negative human health or environmental impacts. With new regulations comes a major increase in samples collected and needing laboratory analysis. Businesses and regulators may need more staff to collect the samples, and labs may need more or new equipment to analyze them. And personally, it is hard to hear media outlets consistently saying that Michigan has the highest number of sites of PFAS contamination. It isn't that Michigan has the most PFAS pollution, it's because we're the ones looking. To meet all these challenges, Michigan adopted a multi-agency approach addressing PFAS as an emerging pollutant. Eagle and many other state departments came together to form MPART, the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Along with that effort, Eagle staff regularly work with local and federal partners to address PFAS contamination at sites across the state. For Eagle's Water Resources Division specifically, once we determine where the pollutants are coming from and the locations of contamination, we need to figure out which regulatory programs to utilize to best solve the problem. The Clean Water Act is great in that it provides us with the tools to regulate emerging pollutants once we learn they are a problem. However, those tools are ultimately reactive. And like all laws and regulations, Eagle staff can only work with the authority and solutions we are granted. That being said, hopefully future amendments will truly address these challenges in a more proactive way. And with that, I think we are going to be opening up for questions. Ryan?
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Brian, and to all of our presenters today. Yeah, we're going to have a quick question and answer panel. So if you could please turn your cameras on, our panel members. And then if you're in the audience, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that, type your question in. I have a number of them in here already, and I'll work on going through them one by one. So let's see here. So I believe this one might be good for Mike, Alexander, or potentially Tarek. How much does atmospheric deposition of mercury from outside the Great Lakes Basin affect Eagle's ability to reduce mercury levels around Michigan waterways?
I think it's a significant source. I don't have a percentage. It might be in our statewide mercury TMDL, but I know it's considered a fairly significant source.
All right. Thanks. Anybody else have anything to add to that one? All right. This next one, I own a small geothermal and solar company. So this one's probably for Zach. Do you have any information or services that can help me grow my business so we can help more people and make a bigger difference?
Yeah, I can give a shot. The probably unsatisfying answer is I don't have anything off the top of my head. Although solar, geothermal, and EV charging solutions are all excellent and the sort of thing that we want to see more of in the state. I am certain that Eagle does have resources on that, and I'd be happy to send them, but I don't have any sort of off the top of my head.
Gotcha. Thanks, Zach. And I should mention that all these questions are going to be sent afterwards to our panelists for potential review. Another kind of related question, we'll keep it on Zach here. Many low-income households are renters and don't control changes like solar panels or energy-saving renovations to their dwelling. How do you incentivize landlords to spend money on improvements that don't directly benefit them? There's such a demand for rentals and more affordable rentals. There's little pressure on landlords to upgrade rental units.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's one that we have considered. I'm not aware of any particular provision in the Mildly Climate Plan for encouraging landlords to upgrade their buildings, but I think that is one of sort of the many considerations at hand where we do see the built environment as one of the more difficult to decarbonize sectors, which does provide us motivation to move quickly on the things that are, not easy to decarbonize, but relatively easier, like the energy production or transportation solutions.
All right, thanks, Zach. Another question, and this is, I'm not sure how, I guess who to direct this to, or this, I guess how we can relate it directly, but it's kind of a two-part question. I'm kind of going to interpret it because it's kind of a longer one. The question is, how can we convince more people to drink tap water in Michigan? And what is a fair plan to fix this issue? And is there information, also, is this information, fix this issue also? Information are announced in public about water. Is there information announced in public about the water quality? And then also the second part of that is they're interested in volunteering to help. Where can people volunteer to, I guess, help with Michigan's water quality? Anybody want to chime in on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then others can fill in too. I'm actually surprised to hear that folks don't drink tap water. I mean, we've always, protect our resources. We protect our surface waters. One of the designated uses that we talked about in our first webinar was protection of drinking water. And I think it's a real critical source for us. It's really important for us on surface water. It's really important for us on groundwater too. So we're protecting surface waters to be used as drinking water sources. We're protecting groundwater to make sure that it can be used, and it is used for about 40% of the drinking water in the state of Michigan. So we want to encourage people to be able to drink tap water, of course, and I think our programs are designed to do that. It's not necessarily part of the Clean Water Act. It's part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's administered by our drinking water folks. But I mean, we tie together very much with them. And what we do to protect our surface waters and protect our groundwaters is eventually good for their programs while they treat groundwaters and surface waters for drinking water purposes. Mike, is there anything else on information that you guys send out based on water quality that people can access?
You can go to our assessment webpage and WRD's and Eagle's webpage, and it has all of our assessment information there. If you want to talk about overall our surface water quality and our designated uses and what's supporting or not. But I can't, there's tons of information there. The only other thing I would recommend maybe, Phil, is for them to reach out to the Drinking Water Division and see what's on their webpage relative to promoting the drinking water use.
Yeah.
I know.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I know that at least in the two communities that I've lived in, the sampling data that the waste or the water treatment plants conduct, I think it's monthly, quarterly, I can't remember, but they publish that, at least the two that I've lived around and when I looked.
Yep, they're required to publish annual reports on drinking water quality. Yes.
All right. Yeah, thank you all for that part. One thing I want to mention is we did put some links in the chat that Mike mentioned on michigan.gov/water quality. How about the second part of that question, as far as how can people, any programs that people can volunteer to help, whether it be monitoring their lakes? Is there anything that anybody wants to mention or can mention that?
Sure, there's you can also check this out on our assessment webpage. I believe we also have, there's a program called MyCore that it's been one of the longest running volunteer monitoring organizations and part of one of the longest volunteer monitoring organizations in the country. There's programs there to that help start up volunteer monitoring programs for inland lakes, the Clean Michigan. I'm sorry, I'm getting the wrong acronym there, but it's on MyCore. There's information on starting up volunteer programs for rivers and streams as well as inland lakes. So a lot of information there. We've got a ton of organizations that are doing that volunteer monitoring around the state. We use that as part of one of our assessment tools to try and to evaluate overall water quality. And I would encourage anyone that's interested in getting into volunteer monitoring to check that group out.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Much appreciated. Yeah, thank you all for answering that question. I'm going to move on. I think this next one might be good for Tarek and or Zach. What mechanisms are in place to ensure regulatory permitting is consistent with the My Healthy Climate Plan or other similar policies? Maybe Phil will want to chime in on this one too. I don't know, any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. And, I think it was really important to present the Michigan Healthy Plan as well. We are doing a division plan as well. And this one is more focused on water quality. It builds on one of the principles that Zach presented. But one of the things that's really important for us is, and I think there was another question about this, about design storms that are used. So what we're trying to do is we're using the most up-to-date record and data for our wet weather program. So we're now all using a common database, which is NOAA Atlas 14. That brings into the most intense and recent higher frequency events that we're seeing. So it's important for us to use that. The second thing we're doing is we're looking through our programs and trying, and you'll see this when we public notice our division program, is you'll be able to look at it and say, okay, for CSO protection, combined sewer overflow protection, or sanitary sewer overflow protection, or for CAFO sizing, we're going to use what is an interim factor, a resiliency factor. What we're proposing to use is a resiliency factor that will help us get to what we think will happen with climate change in terms of intensity. Now, it's hard for us to go through and look at it and say 40 or 50 or 60%. That's not reasonable right now. But we can say, how do we bring our 20th century infrastructure into the 21st century? We're going to look at these resiliency factors for design conditions in the future based on the intensity of rain events that we're seeing now. So we're going to bridge the gap between the Michigan plan and our divisional plan, and we're going to focus on items that are significant to us, and how do we help protect against CSOs and causing water quality problems? How do we help eliminate SSOs when we're seeing higher storm events too? So you'll see that soon, and you'll be able to comment on it.
Thanks, Phil. Does anybody else have anything to add to that before we move on? Right. This next question is pretty broad. And this is related to the Clean Water Act itself. Are there any areas where you see or where you think the Clean Water Act could be strengthened? Anybody feel free to chime into that one, since it kind of relates to all of your programs.
Well, maybe I'll start, and I think Terry can bring up this. One of the main goals in Title I of the Clean Water Act was elimination of pollution by 1985. I mean, we obviously didn't meet that, but I mean, it's a great philosophical goal for the Clean Water Act. And if you look and you remember Tarek's presentation, T-bills, or the technology-based limits, is such a critical part of that. And I really think if there was a better driver in the Clean Water Act, if there was something that required EPA to develop the staff that they need and to be able to propose changes in technology-based effluent limits, the ELGs that are offered, that would be a great help to the state of Michigan if we can have that. For example, if you look at on the municipal side, I mean, they're going through and revising industrial ones. It's not real frequent, but if they did that on an every 10-year basis, I think that would be really good. On the municipal side, it's just secondary treatment standards. And secondary treatment standards haven't been revised since 1972. So, I mean, and the changes that were made in the 80s kind of loosened those requirements. So EPA needs to look at municipal standards and industrial standards and be able to go through and say, hey, how can we update these to what's economically achievable? That would be a great driver for us to be able to implement in our permit section on future MPDES permits.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Anybody else have anything, I guess, to add to that?
I think it could help us address, if there's a way that could be improved to help us address the non-point source contributions to surface waters, that would go along, whether it's through improved voluntary actions and programs, more resources, or some other type of help in that area. But I think that's one of the most significant sources of pollutants to Michigan surface waters right now is non-point source contributions, non-point source pollution. So I think if there were a way that it could help us with that, we would certainly benefit from that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you both. This next one, this next one is a good question related to, we have the Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Water Act of the United States. Someone is asking about, is Eagle in cooperation with Canada, since we share the same water, on projects between the US and Canada? Any projects to mention, or how do we cooperate with Canada? Any thoughts or insights on that? I know we don't think we have anybody involved in our panel related to the Great Lakes Compact. Anybody want to say anything about coordinating with Canada?
So we work with Canada on our Western Lake Erie Annex 4 process. That's one example of how we work with Canada. We work with them on all of our boundary waters where there's issues in our areas of concern programs. We have joint, what they're called BPACs, binational public advisory councils, to help address those issues within our Great Lakes areas of concerns and our Annex 4 process. And we're often brought into discussions with EPA and Environment Canada and others on other issues around the Great Lakes as well.
All right, thanks, Mike. Anybody else?
Ryan, yeah, Ryan, just one thing. There is a really good question that's on there that I kind of want to address. It talks about us and the diversity, lack of diversity in this presentation. That certainly wasn't our intention. And I think if you go back to look at the first and the second presentations for the Clean Water Act, it was a much more diverse group with men and women both presenting. This wasn't our intention today. So I do apologize about that, we were all white males that were on here. So I just wanted to say that for the record. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks for pointing that out. There are a lot of questions, and we're nearing the end. How about one last quick one before we wrap up here? This one probably be for Mike. Please explain total maximum daily loads for rivers, and does the number represent bad pollution?
The numbers in a total maximum daily load are the numbers that would help us maintain our designated use for whatever has been impacted. For example, fish tissue is a good example. If we've got a site-specific fish tissue or a fish consumption issue within a stream, we want to determine, what levels of pollutants are going in the stream and what reductions are needed to reduce those fish tissue numbers. And so the total maximum daily loads are developed because there is an exceedance or an impact to a designated use, an exceedance of a water quality value or standard. And the TMDL is designed to identify sources and reduce those sources so that we can meet our surface water quality goals and our water quality standards.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, and unless the panel has anything that they want to add before we wrap up, I just have a couple closing things. Yeah, thank you all for being part of our panel today and for presenting, and for the audience for such great questions and for being part of this webinar today. As we mentioned before, this is part of a webinar series. We have 3 webinars in the series. This is the final one on 50 years of the Clean Water Act. You can find out more information. You can see the recordings from these webinars at www.michigan.gov/CWA50. So be able to see them at that time. You also see other Clean Water Act events that are going on. And the next one is actually a Twitter chat at noon going on right now after we end this. And then also, as we wrap up, you'll get a couple emails from me. One will have a survey and a certificate for this webinar. And then we'll also send you a link to the recording in case you didn't want to go to our Clean Water Act 50 page. That'll go to your email. So with that, thank you all again. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.